Hello and welcome to Technique Friday. And it's been a long time since I've done a Technique Friday, but I had a lot of requests over my hiatus from Technique Fridays, and I have Friday tea. Now there's a couple of things, and one of them was texture gels. Now look, I am not the queen of texture gels, and I tend to make my own up if I go, but I do have two coarse gels. I have a white sand texture gel from Pebeo, and I have a coarse texture gel from Reeves. Also in texture, I've had a lot of questions about impasto and how and why it's used. Now I've used impasto in a fine art painting, and I'm going to show you a few photos from the process of that painting to show you how this actually works. And finally, I've got some Liquitex heavy gesso. Now I'm putting this into the texture because it's really heavy, and you use it for a particular reason. It is not a gesso that you would prepare. It says surface preparation, but really traditionally you wouldn't waste a heavy gesso by preparing it on a canvas because it's too thick. You would waste too much of it, and it's really there for texture and to build some body into your page. Now one of these, I'm doing this on a dark, I've just got some scratch paint that I put in when I was doing another page the other night, and got the vestiges of a cough. I just thought I'd show you the sorts of things that I actually use a texture gel for. Now I want you to think to yourself that these you can add inks to, you can add Delusion spray to them, you can add paint to them. You need to be careful when you mix things because it weakens the structure of a texture gel. So I would use something that's very highly pigmented like golden, or an acrylic ink if that's what you're wanting. I'm actually going to leave this clear or white. I want to see what it dries like on a darker surface, but I traditionally use texture gels for something like a brick wall, where you then want to paint something that is textured. The other time that I've seen this used really well is the middle part of sunflowers. So I saw a really large sunflower canvas, and the whole middle part where all the sunflower seeds grow was all done in heavy texture. Really well done. And you really can't draw over it, you can't really use crayons over it because it's got too much tooth. So it's one of those things that this is often a final coat. So I'm going to use two different types of gels here from the two brands, and you can already see, and I'll just zoom in, you can already see that the one is very coarse, this one here is very coarse, and this is much finer. So I'm going to use a palette knife and just pick up the first one, and it is very sandy, and I'm just going to go down. See how sandy, you can hear it, how sandy that is? Perfect for a really grainy brick wall. And remember, if you're using a stencil, you really need to clean your stencil after this application. Very gritty, awesome texture. Let me get a tissue and wipe that texture off. Okay, so that's the Pebeo sand texture gel. Now I'm going to apply the Reeves, which is incredibly, oh look, it's much finer. You can already see it in the application. Still gritty, but it's almost like a clear gesso Some of the clear gessos I've used are really quite gritty. And that concludes that part of the lesson. So what I'll be doing is applying everything in this lesson, and then I will come back and the next part of the lesson will be when these are all dry. So you've got some awesome texture there, and if you wanted to do something gritty, you can see, looking at them side on, that they're very thick. And particularly this sand one, it looks just like bricks. It really, really does. It's an awesome look. Okay, the next one I'm going to talk to you about is impasto. Now, impasto is an additive, and it is an additive to create exaggerated texture. So, just a little bit about acrylic paints. Acrylic paints have water in them, and as they dry and form a plastic, the liquid evaporates out of them and they flatten. So even if you were to put, this is a dimension paint, it's supposed to keep its dimension, but it doesn't keep it. Like if you get a normal acrylic or a fluid acrylic, you wouldn't get very much texture at all. They always dry very, very flat. Now this is what I used on my autumn flowers painting, and it is not to be used on its own. Impasto is never to be used on its own. It's always to be used in conjunction with paint. So I'm just going to pull a little bit out, and so it looks really lovely creamy. I use a Montmartre brand because it's the easiest one for me to source, and it's a good price. Now I'm going to use another palette knife to get my gold point. Now the rule of thumb is that it's usually about 50-50 or a little bit less. You just have to experiment with it. I wouldn't recommend this on journal pages. You could definitely use it on journal covers. You could definitely use this on canvases. But you have to have a look at the ratio. So this particular, can you see that how as I'm mixing it in, it looks really structured and textured. Now the thing with impasto is when I use that here, so I'm going to use that and leave it, bang, then I'm going to go here and go down a different direction, and then let's just show it there, different direction, different direction, and you can see this lovely texture that I'm building here. It makes a lot, so you have to be prepared to use it all. That's why it's good. But it creates beautiful, beautiful texture. And I'm just going to finish this off down the bottom. And you can do all sorts of things with it. So I'm just going to go along and create some. And this will be more interesting when it dries. So I'm just going to create some notches in that, so they can really see that it's really textured, but that's the way it should dry. Now that's going to take overnight to dry. It takes a really long time to dry because it's so thick, so that's the important thing to remember with impasto. It slows down the drying time of the acrylic, so you can work with it more. If I wanted to impress stamp images into it or do something like that, it works very, very well. So that is the impasto, and now I'm going to throw up images from my autumn flowers painting where I show you a large canvas where I used this impasto to create texture over the whole canvas. So the last texture that I'm going to show you is heavy gesso. Now, I just recently bought this. There you go. I have to open it. And my goodness, it's the most creamiest, yummiest thing that I've seen in a long time.
Is it your time of the month? Yes.
And again, this is really great for using a palette knife or catalyst tools. So what I'm going to do here is just create, and doesn't it look like it's got like impasto? But this is just the gesso. And this is one of the things I love about heavy gesso, is it will create and keep its texture. And you can do interesting impressions with it, or writings with it. I'm just grabbing a catalyst tool. So this is just a basic catalyst tool, and you can see I'm just going to put some lines in this, and this is how you can get this in a basic gesso pattern. So again, you can see the height and the texture. We'll let this dry. It's looking pretty awesome, this page. I'll have to do something with it. And I'm just wiping off my catalyst tool. This is really lovely used through stencils, so you can colour gesso and just be careful you don't thin it out too much, or you can paint over the gesso after it's dried. So now what I'm going to do is leave this in its entirety so that you can see what it looks like wet, and then we'll come back tomorrow when it looks dry. Hello and welcome to the last part of Technique Friday, and have a look. Everything is dry, and the reason that this looks a little bit different is that I've decided to pick up the Handycam because you can't see the actual texture in something from an overhead view. So what I want to show you is, this is the impasto. Have a look at that texture. Can you see the textures from the ridges? And you see the beautiful body, and up here that's really quite tall. Let me put it on its side so you can see. Can you see the texture there? Looks delicious and gorgeous, and it's hard as. And that's one of the things that I love about impasto. The big surprise, I think, was this sand gel. Now, if I put my nails on that, it is really, really thick. Can you see how thick that is? Really, really thick. That's this gel, the Pebeo Studio Sand Texture Gel. And then we had the Reeves Coarse Gel, which was much easier to put on, and that's much finer, more see-through, more of the medium, less of the grains. But if I was to put those together, that is nowhere near as chunky as that. So this, awesome for snow. You can colour these, so I could get like a red brick kind of a paint, brown with a bit of red in it, and create bricks out of that, and then they would be coloured and looking really, really awesome. The last thing that I wanted to show you was the thick gesso, and again the fingernail test. Very, very thick. Can you see that? Very, very thick. Looks awesome. Feels smooth and beautiful. Imagine then painting over that and using maybe inks to, you could do dyes and inks that run down the rivulets and give you all different patterns that soak into the gesso, because they will soak into the gesso. It's an amazing thing to work with gesso. This particular thing I think is great for using with stencils and using for very much like an impasto. Impasto you can add paint to. Gesso you can add, you don't really add paint to it. You can add some acrylic inks to it, but I wouldn't add paint to it as such. You can mix it with some paint, mix it with some dyes to give it a lovely colour, but if you want to give your normal acrylics shape and texture, then definitely use the impasto. That's exactly what it's for, and I'm using a Montmartre impasto, and it's definitely does what it says. There are different brands. I'm sure there's lots of different impastos out there, but have a look at the texture in that. And as you can see, it can have a really great effect when you use it on a canvas. A lot of these texture pastes I wouldn't necessarily use a lot of, apart from possibly the heavy gesso. I wouldn't use a lot of inside a journal, particularly these. They're rough and they'll ruin whatever page they rub against. But on the outside of a journal cover, again, if you're going to put it in a bookcase where they're all together, you'd think seriously about whether you wanted the roughness against the cover of another journal. So you need to really think about where you will use these textures and in what context, and how protected anything that butts up against it will be. But that concludes my Technique Friday lesson for this week. If you've got any other hints or questions or requests for stuff, then just let me know in the comments below or send me an email. Ciao for now. Learn something new today. It keeps you young.